We can. Thanks so much. All right, like we said, thanks to everyone for being here today. We are recording, so we will share this out after. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us and learn with us today. My name is Bren Miaida Cooch. I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently the interim co-president for Society of Gender Professionals. I'm also the co-lead for the Breaking Gender and Sex Binaries Circle, which is a community of practice. And then coincidentally, I'm also the previous co-director of the annual conference for GAIN. So really happy to be here. These two organizations are very near and dear to me in my heart, and many, many hours over the past decade spent in them. We are here again. We are moving my little notification, establishing truly gender inclusive spaces. And really this is going to be sort of two organizational case studies on creating gender inclusion from the get-go, or for even repivoting from an organization that maybe wasn't as gender inclusive before. So really happy to be here today we have two folks representing the Society of Gender Professionals who are going to talk about SGP's journey, and then two folks representing GAIN, the Gender Advocacy and Inclusion Network in Higher Education, formerly known as Oregon Women in Higher Education. And yeah, just really happy and appreciative of everyone for joining us and sharing their stories so we can all learn together. Go ahead for the next slide. Great, thank you. And then just a couple housekeeping items. You can update your name and pronouns. If you find your little box with your face in it, you can click the three dots on the upper right-hand corner and go to change your name and pronouns there. You can turn on captions using the bar in the bottom of Zoom. Please use the chat for discussion, for questions. If you do have questions for the panelists, we'll collect those and ask them later if we have time. And if you have a question for a specific person, please make sure to note who that question is for. Also, like we said before, but more folks have joined, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know your name, your pronouns, where you're calling in from today, and why you joined, like what you really hope to get out of the session, because we're curious to know that, to make sure we can address that. If you do have tech questions, please send those directly to Megan Simone. Megan is doing all of our tech, and she's waving right now, and she really helped a lot with the organization and was instrumental in creating this panel. So thank you so much, Megan. And thank you for doing all of our tech support today. Just a couple notes, the chat should remain respectful. We're all here to learn about creating inclusive organizations, and we want to make sure that the chat reflects this respectful, inclusive environment that we're creating. So please adhere to that. We want this to be as safe a space as we can, so that we can all, again, learn together. And just to note, there is no perfect answer for being inclusive. You won't leave here today with a checklist of like things to do to make an inclusive organization. We're all just here sharing best practices and sharing the things that our panelists have done in their organizations to create this inclusion. So thanks for being with us today and being understanding. And yeah, like I said, we'll share the recording after, and I think we can go ahead and get things kicked off. So we're going to start out hearing about Society of Gender Professionals and the founding of SGP. Next slide. And first, we will hear from Karine Lepeye, whose name I probably mispronounced. Karine's the founder and former co-president of SGP. And SGP, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a few minutes, this is a nonprofit organization of gender practitioners and academics and activists who are really dedicated to promoting feminist action and applied research, and also raising the profile of gender expertise around the world. So really great organization. If you haven't joined, please come join us. We'll put in some links for membership at the end of the conversation. Karine is currently working as the Global Director for Girls Education and Gender Equality at a really great nonprofit called Room to Read. And she was formerly the Director for Gender Policy and Practice at the Navanti Group, which is a conflict research firm. And then she's led the operationalization, if I said that right, of gender mainstreaming policies around the world, including as principal of Inclusive Societies, where she worked with partners to address structural barriers to gender equality. It's very impressive. And Karine, I think you can go ahead and take it away.
Okay, great. Next slide. I'm actually not going to go through the mission of SGP and just have this for reference. I was hoping that we could make this more of a like a fireside chat because as Bren was noting, this is a conversation. I think we are learning all the time. But I'm very happy that you brought this group together because these are not conversations that we have a chance to have a lot. And I will just tell you from in the life of an organization, when you're thinking about inclusion, you're going to be faced with different questions about inclusion at different stages. And at the very beginning, we were thinking most deeply about structure and about culture. So especially for those of us working on issues of social justice and equity, I think institutions can be very dangerous places. They can be the means by which individuals can feel very confident about treating others like they are less valuable, or that their voices and experiences are less important. So these are places where people can experience coercion, judgment, and violence. So all of us had these experiences with very patriarchal and hierarchical organizations. And not many of us had experienced alternatives, but we knew that we desperately needed something different. And so when we set up the structures for SGP, we were very focused on 4 things: power sharing, joint decision-making, mutual accountability, and representation. So from the beginning, we did everything structurally, but also visually. And here you can go to the next slide to portray this as a group effort and a group project, and definitely not a personal project of a feminist diva, which can happen. The things that we wanted to accomplish could only be accomplished as a group. And we didn't want anyone to look at SGP and feel that it was not a place for them to grow because they were entering into someone else's project. And at the beginning, this can sometimes happen. So we wanted people to see it was a place that they could belong. So visually, we tried to create not a sense of hierarchy. Even when we signed off on emails, we put all of our first names, alphabetical order, so no one could sense hierarchy. But of course, we had to deal with some hierarchy on the team. When we put in our paperwork to become a nonprofit in the US, we had to name a president, we had to name a treasurer, and we had to name a board. So we were forced into a certain amount of legal hierarchy. But in our practice, we tried to minimize that as much as possible. We had a co-leadership model. And here we can go to the next slide. At first, we had 2 co-presidents, but we eventually brought on a third because we had this idea that each co-president would represent in some way the 3 groups within SGP. So activists, academics, and practitioners. And the reality is that most of us actually were a combination of all of these 3 things. But this idea that we would dedicate certain decision-making positions to individuals based on their ability to represent the needs of a certain group was really important and not uncontroversial. 3 co-presidents also allowed more space for learning and for growth. The incoming co-president was learning the ropes, the current co-president was setting the agenda for the year, and the outgoing co-president was mentoring and engaging with the advisory council. And we also ended up with 3 co-presidents because none of us were paid for this work, and it was a very heavy workload. And we all had lives and work outside of SGP. So we really had to share the load. We set up systems of mutual accountability. So none of this like reporting up to a president kind of thing. We had at the startup, we had a group of people that all took on certain responsibilities in the organization, and those were well defined. But we were all reporting out on our own pieces to each other every week. And we rotated who led the meetings and prepared the agendas. And during our meetings, we had set agenda items that included time to discuss tensions. And we always had tensions. And when we had to make decisions, we used collective and consensus-based decision-making practices. So what that means is, for those of you who have not had the chance to practice this, it's time-consuming, but also achieves things that you can't achieve otherwise. We would go around the room to get everyone's opinion on the decision and thoughts and suggestions for alternatives. And if one person disagreed, we did not move forward until we could find a solution that everyone could be satisfied with in one way or another. It doesn't mean that there was a yay on every decision. Sometimes people abstained. We would make sure in the record that we had a record of why they abstained and what they thought the issues were, but they were willing to move forward. So we wanted to make sure that there was transparency around that there was never this idea that a decision was a clear-cut thing. You know, every decision, you know, usually had a record of discussion and counterpoints and all of the tensions. So we have records of all of that. And then in terms of reporting, we also set up bi-yearly membership meetings where everyone in a position of responsibility within the organization was asked to report back on their efforts to SGP members. And it was the same thing like this webinar has been set up where anyone could, you know, speak and ask questions, and we left a lot of time for that. But that included, so everyone on the secretariat committee, task forces, circles would be reporting out. And then in the beginning stages, we were also deeply aware of the need for those making decisions to represent the diversity in our membership. And as a startup group, we did not represent this diversity. We were a self-selected group of people. We had the time, the energy, and the need to build this organization, and we represented our small network. So I brought in gender practitioners, Christy Kelly, who is co-president with me, who was our only feminist academic, and she brought in her students. But we knew that we needed to diversify really quickly and to put in place a process for us to transition out of leadership responsibly, which we ended up doing. So when we had our first election to the secretariat and the committees, we knew that it wasn't enough to advertise in our networks, even through the different listservs and social media that we had. And we actually saw the advisory council as playing a big role in this, in recruitment for elections, because we saw them as hubs or centers of networks of trust. And that when they shared an opportunity or pinged people individually for positions, that really made a difference. And we found that when we did that, we just had so much more response and success. So the advisory council was really pivotal to that. And when we were putting together options for who we wanted to bring in, we had this huge spreadsheets with, you know, with all kinds of individuals who would bring this different kinds of expertise and lived experience to the group. We made sure that there was LGBTQ representation, both in terms of identity, but also in terms of activism. So queer scholars, as well as scholars or practitioners who focused on LGBT work. And in the same way, we identified people who both worked on regional issues, as well as people who represented geographic diversity, and a number of other factors. And one key thing for the advisory council that was really a decision that we kind of mulled over was, is your advisory council for raising money? Or is it for something else? And we decided that we were not going to have an advisory council that was really just there to raise money. We needed them and wanted them for their expertise and for their lived experience. So that was really key to that role and to diversifying the organization. One thing that I wish we had done from the start, but we didn't, was actually to insist on having certain advisory council spots reserved to represent LGBTQ experiences and forms of expertise, in the same way that we had been intentional about that for the co-president positions. We had reached out to trans and queer scholars at the start, but none of them were available or doing other things or not interested. But we should have made it a non-negotiable for us, especially because the mission of our organization and the tendency in our field to prioritize the needs of and experiences of cisgender women. And at least for practitioners, for gender practitioners who work in the international development sector, LGBTQ issues are completely sidelined in gender work. And yet you cannot do this work without understanding that the systems that create sexism create homophobia and transphobia, and these are intertwined and inseparable. And yet that's not what you see in the sector. So I think this is a strategic decision that we should have made, but didn't. We had so many questions that we were asking ourselves about what it means to set up a structure that allows people to participate in ways that that are most comfortable for them and meaningful and safe for them. And also we were looking at like life stages and career stages that, you know, mean that people would interact in different ways at different times. But I think I am at time. Am I at time? I am way over time. So I'm going to hand it over to Syra to talk about some of the ways in which we answered those questions, at least on the communication side of things. So thank you. And Syra, on to you.
Thanks, Karine. Next slide, if you can, Megan. Great. So yeah, we're going to hear from Syra about incorporating more of that inclusion. If you can go to the next slide, learn a little bit more about Syra, who co-leads SGP's Feminist Communications Gender Circle, which is really awesome, and also served on SGP's founding board, as you saw in the image that Karine showed earlier. They've worked in a range of sectors, including adult education, the private sector, community nonprofits, international and regional feminist and human rights organizations. Quite the resume, and recently began working in government, focusing on gender and disability rights. Syra also serves on the advisory councils of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, International Solidarity Network, and the Racial Equity Index. Syra, we are very excited to hear from you about building inclusion into SGP. Oh, and you are muted.
Yes, thank you, Bren. So as you heard, the issue of inclusion across a range of identities is critical to SGP's ability to grow as an international network and association. And it grew out of a certain geography, but we're also looking at, you know, a range of different identities and social and physical locations. And on the slide, you can see there's 81 different countries where SGP has had registered members since the registration system launched. So that's across all continents. And the initial idea was always a global association of gender professionals where nobody has to identify with any particular gender, as well as any other particular identity to join. But the process of actually making and growing a membership association and building it in a global and inclusive way requires very conscious commitment and effort. So SGP developed that full membership registration system and website after incorporating in 2018. And you've heard some of the tensions that Karine talked about in terms of feminist ways of working in the process of institutionalizing the association. But that institutionalization was a necessary step. SGP has now fully transitioned from the founding board to a fully elected board since 2021. And the registered membership, their diversity coming from all over the world is also important for the diversity of our knowledge base and membership. And those people can nominate, run for elections, vote for SGP secretariat members and committee co-leads, and then those elected positions are in turn accountable to the membership. And as we go to the next slide, I'm just going to say, just, you know, looking at the chat, we can see that in terms of the geographic spaces represented, we have people from, you know, UK, Cambodia, Canada, Germany, India, Colombia, Bangladesh, Myanmar. So even though GAIN has a US-based constituency, mainly our stakeholders, SGP has a global one. So that means that we're also looking at so many different aspects of identity in order to be inclusive. But there is a focus of any gender expression so long as there's a commitment to feminist values and promoting gender justice. And cis and transgender women and men and non-binary people have worked on developing and growing SGP since the earliest stages. So there's limitations on how much we can do to promote intersectionality and inclusivity across all of these axes. And you can see a number of them, a really broad range that are depicted on the slide, which is showing the academic wheel of privilege chart. But because we're living in heteronormative and patriarchal cultures that are the focus of feminist resistance, anyone challenging those norms and values is critically, you know, potentially able to engage in SGP's reasons for existing. And we have to balance that inclusion with other intersecting identities relating to race or geographic location or class or migration status or coloniality or ability as much as we can, as well as these other characteristics. As such, SGP is focusing when we communicate out to membership or when we communicate out to people who are following SGP's newsletter or communications or reports or social media. We're trying to amplify voices that are less heard or that are willfully silenced, particularly on issues that are intersecting and including and encompassing what is traditionally women's rights, but also relating to gender identity and privilege, sexual orientation, and heteronormativity. Anybody of any gender, of course, can be an SGP member. And so the voice speaking for SGP is not by definition a female one when we publish, but it's a voice that might be someone who identifies as a woman or a man or as neither binaristic category or other categories. And that also is framed and influenced by the language that we're using. So as we move to the next slide, I'm just going to mention that by necessity, we're working in English as the main working language, but there are people of all sorts of mother tongues who are participating, and we try to remain cognizant of that, and also try and amplify the ways that we share like multilingual resources in respect of that. Next slide. So this, oops, oh sorry, previous slide we're going. Yeah. Okay, so this graphic is a drawing from a short video, one of those "If the World Were 100 People" sources. And, you know, from the earliest consciousness, we see this division, this dominant discourse that presents the world in binaristic ways. And it's very difficult to get away from, but we know that even if we're looking strictly at intersexuality and the proportion of the population that doesn't have XX or XY chromosomes, that there are actually many other ones. That's at least a minimum of 1 or 2% of the population. So if we're estimating only intersex or transgender or non-binary in terms of identification, and these classifications, of course, are very different according to local culture, language, histories, etc., then that's, you know, at least some 5% of a given population, maybe. Then the microcosm of the Earth's population is simply not 50-50, and we know this. And that doesn't even touch upon the issue of attraction or orientation, or not having an orientation in either direction or any direction. And, you know, these grouped concepts are all covered in LGBTQI or 2S LGBTQI acronyms, but there's all sorts of shades of nuance within that. So we might be talking about anywhere up to 20 or 25% more of the population of the globe or more, if only we lived in a safe and an affirming enough world to find out. And, you know, this is also, sorry, next slide. And this is also a question of, you know, the inclusion of women as well as gender or sexual minorities in SGP's key constituencies is therefore always a conscious effort in how we're communicating. Because threats to the normativity and power and binaristic identities that are imposed on us and that are based on gender and sex categories can come from any person disrupting or undermining those norms by their being or by their actions. So in essence, we're seeking to profile and highlight voices from any gender challenging limitations on our choices and behaviors, and promoting individual rights according to a worldview that sees gender and sex in more fluid and inclusive and expansive ways. And that's reflected in the famous bell hooks quote depicted on the slide about how rigid binaries are a form of violence. So the first act of violence patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. Next slide. And as we publish and communicate in SGP's voice, we remain conscious of all those different diversities, and also that the majority of the population that's producing and posting most of the content on the internet is heavily weighted towards Anglophone, male presenting, Northern, male identifying, and a range of other factors that are connected to power and privilege. All of these carry over from the physical into the virtual world where SGP is mainly functioning and mainly communicating. So we endeavor to publish from a voice that's sharing that different lens. At the same time, even though we note that the voice of SGP is generally speaking more female, more non-binary, not located in one particular place, etc., we still keep in mind that cisgender men are as able to contribute to advancing gender justice as cisgender women are, or non-binary people are, or people of sexual minority genders. The contrast on this slide, for example, shows Nazir Afzal, who is a famous, well-known British solicitor who has made great contributions on addressing gender-based violence, versus the first cisgender woman prime minister of the UK, who was known for promoting regressive policies. So, and we have 1 minute left, so I'll try to be very brief and some key slides coming up. Next slide, please. So a key way that SGP incorporates this diverse range of perspectives is through the growing diversity of SGP members who can then become elected to leadership roles, and through the diversity of members and supporters who are involved in programming, such as SGP's community of practice. And those communities of practice are called the gender circles. And the slide shows the gender circles page of the website, and there's a number of active different circles. The Feminist Communication Circle is one, and Breaking Binaries, as Bren mentioned, is another one. Next slide, please. So this circle helps to embed in SGP the more gender inclusive ways of communicating or programming that we need to use. Circle members share key insights and resources through the newsletter and communications channel, drawing from the regular meetings that circle members hold, where they delve deeper into issues of sexuality, gender, and rights. And the Feminist Communication Circle and the Secretariat also benefit a lot from that lived experience and collective knowledge that's brought together from the circle. They serve as a consultative body, as I mentioned, and they actively demonstrate and normalize more expansive use of language and pronouns in SGP spaces, or in our sharing of information about gender inclusive concepts and identities from different religions or cultures or regions. Circle members are also able to assess the inclusivity of language in our reporting and publications, or promote more inclusionary or less binaristic expression or imagery in SGP's websites or in meetings and spaces. And it's also impacted the way that I identify, right? So I've shifted my pronoun use through working with the binary circle, and where we are in spaces where it's safe to share more gender inclusive pronouns. I try to use my privilege in that way. This role is also increasingly necessary because SGP shares a lot of different types of news and analysis and resources on rights and justice and issues of gender diversity and inclusion. And the Breaking Binary Circle helps us ensure that the sources we're using are reliable on these issues, reviewing and evaluating at a time when we're seeing more and more coordinated anti-trans rights organizing happening. We can see that this issue is becoming manipulated, as the open letter that was recently published about the New York Times, I think in the last month. So there's efforts to drive a wedge between different parts of feminist movements that are clearly and increasingly coordinated. And it's critical that we foster and grow a vision of feminism that promotes a gender liberatory future instead of a binaristic vision that inevitably erases our individuality and pluralism and reinforces hierarchies. And on the last slide.
Okay, we're at time, so if you can go super fast through the last slide, and then we'll move on to
just a last slide quoting Zanele Muholi's a famous South African artist who talks about gender fluidity and coming to understand themselves as a non-binary person, as just a human. And I think that the vision of the future that SGP is promoting and pulling feminist movements towards is that non-binary future. And we'll hear from the GAIN partners next. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Yeah, so now Gender Advocacy and Inclusion Network, formerly Oregon Women in Higher Education. And we have two members of the board, previous and current, talking about this, as we called it, the pivot from OE to GAIN. So first, next slide. I'm super happy to introduce Erica Curry. Erica began their professional career in online higher education, supporting faculty in course development and technology while supervising 18 student employees. That is too many for one person. She then worked with program leads and school heads to launch new online degree programs. Then after leaving higher education, Erica has been leading professional education and diversity, equity, and inclusion, fair housing, housing accessibility efforts at the state level for the Realtor Trade Association, and they also have an MBA in business analytics. So Erica, thank you so much for talking to us about the pivot once again. Turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, next slide. So I was the chair of the board for Oregon Women in Higher Education, and I have the privilege of, I am now serving on SGP as the treasurer. So I get to be in both groups as well, which is fantastic. Oregon Women in Higher Education is a professional association for women, originally for women in higher education and folks who identify as women in higher education within the state of Oregon. And it was all about networking and professional development and connection. So next slide, please. A little bit of history about OE. Oregon Women in Higher Ed, we also will call OE on occasion, was founded in the 80s by Joanne Johnson Trow and Donna Salvik. It was part of the American Council of Education's Women's Network. And so from the 80s until 2010, it was we just had an annual conference up in Portland. In 2010, they created a board of directors and then started having conferences around the state to be more accessible and equitable. And they also started to begin sprinkling in programming throughout the year, which has really taken off in the last couple of years. Next slide, please. All right, so I joined the board planning for the 2019 conference, and this is right after our first conference, the first night of the first conference that this board was all together. And in planning for the conference, we had our annual board retreat at the coast. And so when I stepped into OE, a few things that I had heard is that OE had a history of being less exclusionary, that we had caused a lot of harm for women of color in higher education in the past. And so I really wanted us to double down on what we meant when we said that we were diverse and inclusive, and make sure that we were actually baking equity into everything that we were doing. So I started us out with what we called equity talks. I'm not an expert in DEI content, but it was, especially at that time, I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to have a stake in what we were doing and talk about equity and inclusion from a space that was honest and authentic to them and their experience, and to have some ownership of that. So each member of the board got to pick a topic, and they just presented for 15 minutes on something equity related, diversity, equity, inclusion related, in that would educate the board members. What that ended up giving us was just this incredible foundation as we moved through the rest of the planning for the board and for the year, of how do these different elements of equity and inclusion show up, and what are the things that we have a lot of room to grow on. And it just gave us a really great space to start talking about that. And one of the questions that came up is we say Oregon Women in Higher Ed, does that mean it's just cis women, or trans women included, or non-binary folks included? And we as the board were like, well, of course. And Bren was on the board at this time, and they asked, well, how do people know that? How does anybody know that? And we're like, oh, that's a great question, because our name is Oregon Women in Higher Ed. We can fix that. So next slide, please. So we did our initial fix. We started by saying and gender minorities, and it was in our vision and our mission, but we knew that wasn't enough. And so for the first year, we sat on this, we really chewed on it. And we updated our mission and vision and our bylaws to say and gender minorities everywhere, because we did want to be explicitly inclusive. But next slide, please. But we had what we called the W question, because I want you all to look at this logo. And what do you notice about that W? It says a lot about how OE defines feminism. It says a lot about how OE defines womanhood, and it's infantilizing. It is, there's some things about that W that are not great, and emblematic of kind of how this organization had self-identified as, or had identified womanhood and what it was that we were centering as an organization. So we had another annual conference, and we came back for the next round of board talks. So next slide, please. And again, we all went to the coast. We had a fantastic time. But in these equity talks, we covered things from anything from diet culture and fat phobia to the role of justice plays in diversity, equity, inclusion work, and how central justice is to that work. And then we also had a really good presentation on gender and breaking gender binaries. And as we moved forward, we realized that we needed to do more to be more intentional in this gender inclusion, that just having and gender minorities in our mission and vision wasn't enough. And next slide, please. This fabulous bell hooks quote, or I'm sorry, Audre Lorde quote, really was a guiding star for us. And it's, we are not here as women examining racism in a political and social vacuum. We operate as the teeth of the system for which racism and sexism are primary, established, and necessary props of profit. we as an organization, if we were not being intentionally anti-oppression, if we were not intentionally being intersectional, if we were not intentionally creating safety for the most vulnerable members of our community, then we were upholding violence. We were perpetuating oppression. And so for us, it was really incredibly important to, oh yeah, you can see Brendan in the picture. Sorry, I just got distracted by the chat. So for us, it was incredibly important to consider, how are we, if we're going to say that this is a space in which we want to include folks if we want to center folks who are not cis women, who are not, and we want to break patriarchy instead of being an organization which actually helps uphold the patriarchy, how do we do that? And so for us, next slide, we had to do, it required a few different tiers of approach. So we did a lot of education for members. At our annual convention, we had these gender unicorns taped up in every bathroom stall. I think now the preferred is the genderbread person, but we had the gender unicorns up in every bathroom. We had gender neutral bathrooms, and that wasn't without pushback. We would have people who would rip down the bathroom signs and we would just go and put them right back up. We had pronoun pins laid out everywhere. In all of our opening remarks, we would talk to the members about, this is what we're doing. We are being very intentional about this space. Next slide, please. But just educating wasn't enough, because again, we needed to ensure that this space was a safe space for folks, for everyone. And so we created these community care guidelines. I believe we copied them from Oregon Women in, I just lost the acronym, Portland Women in Tech. And so these community care guidelines, we had really specific, this is, if you experience harm, this is where you can report it. This is what you can trust us as staff or as volunteer leaders to take care of and to do to ensure that you're safe. If you disregard these care guidelines, you will be asked to leave and you will not be invited back. So we created, thank you, PDX Women in Tech or Lesbians Who Tech. It was one of the two groups. I believe it was PDX Women in Tech that was where we got these community guidelines from. And so, and we had like, here's the protocol, here's the escalation practice. And so we were really explicit in how we were going to create safety in the physical space of the conference. Next slide, please. And then we also publish a lot of, so this is all at the annual conference. We're getting our members included in this vision and this and in the value framework that we are moving the organization forward in. And we wrote a couple blog posts really explaining how we were moving from a passively inclusive organization. And again, I think passively inclusive, even that denies our explicit role in upholding oppressive binaries and patriarchal systems, to moving to anti-oppression and centering marginalized and intersectional identities in higher education rather than groups that were used to being dominant. And all right, so we're getting close to time. So we also put together, next slide, resources, and we wanted to include our membership in this educational journey with us. And so we put webinars on and that sort of thing. But really, that was my role in this pivot. And then Shania had the hard work of implementing. So I'm really excited to pass it over to Shania for the next part.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks for noticing my flailing. So Shania had the job of implementing this pivot that Erica was just talking about. Next slide, please. Shania is Assistant Director currently of Career and Fellowship Advising for Reed College's Center for Life Beyond Reed. She's also the outgoing chair for GAIN's Board of Directors and has been a member of the board since 2020. She has 5 years of experience working in higher education across public and private colleges, and then also experience addressing gender inequities in college athletics through her research with the Northwest Athletic Conference Female Student Athletes. And Shania, I think I will just turn it over to you to talk to us a little bit more about your implementation of the pivot.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bren. Thank you, Erica. I'm really excited to be here today. I think a lot of this work that I did over the last couple of years for, OE, now GAIN, I'm really proud of this work, and it allowed me the opportunity in this presentation to dust dust off some cobwebs in my brain. I haven't had the chance to talk about this in a while. So for context, and I think this is important, I have been on the board for a very long time, and I've been on the board for during a point in the world where things got a little stressful, hectic, and unpredictable. When I joined the board in 2020, we were in the middle of a pandemic. And I stepped into a brand new role as the Director of Records and Analytics. That role hadn't existed prior to that year. And so I had the opportunity to explore what it meant to create sustainable systems in this board through data and record keeping. And then transitioned to chair of the board in January of 21. I had the privilege of having amazing people to refer to when I took over as chair. But I think it's important to know that, yeah, during that time, the pandemic created a lot of challenges in our ability to engage with one another. We were operating completely virtually, as I'm sure many of you were. So training and onboarding was really tough. We weren't able to provide retreats that fully, that gave us the opportunity to fully know each other as, board members and people. The board of directors for OE usually consists of multiple people across multiple institutions in Oregon. So we're not operating out of one college. We're operating out of usually 5, 6, 7 different colleges. So we don't have the chance to see each other very often. The pandemic created challenges in our ability to plan into conferences. So we had to pivot to a virtual conference. And all of these different elements create trickle-down effects in our ability to operate. And so from my observations, when I first joined the board as the Director of Records and Analytics, I knew the pivot was something that was important to Erica and important to other members of the board. And also we were challenged with addressing the ripple effect and harm and fear that was caused by the murder of George Floyd. And I think looking back on that time, the pivot was definitely a priority, and it just wasn't time yet to fully commit to that because we also had to care for our members in other ways. So in 2021, we had a virtual conference, and then in 2022, that was the year that I was chair. Our conference was planned to be in person, and we made the tough decision to cancel because we didn't want to be a super spreader in the state of Oregon. And we also had to pivot to a virtual conference. Next slide. But in that year of 21 and 22, as the chair, I was set with creating the strategy and vision for our organization, which I knew was going to look like, was going to be something different than what I was handed in the beginning. And so as chair, I had to really take some time to think about who am I going to be as a leader, understanding that our organization is pretty flat. And that is, the purpose of OE at the time was to have a flat organization because we really saw each other as co-working directors. And my goal as chair was to really help facilitate the amazing work of my board. So a good leader is someone who is constantly learning from their peers, staff, their failures, really thinking about and learning about their own positionality and power as leader. Because in this context, I didn't really see myself as the leader. I saw myself as the facilitator and as the switchboard. So, and boards evolve, people matriculate, there's attrition. So I really took my experience as the Director of Records and Analytics, and my priority was to create sustainability in our operations and our documentation. And that was something that was foundational to the pivot. I wasn't going to do a pivot if I couldn't really believe in my ability to create institutional history and to create sustainability inside of our Google Drive. Which I'm sure, as you can imagine, some of your Google Drives are probably either really, really organized or really, really disorganized. And so those were my primary goals, was to create a new organization that had really strong legs underneath it. And we had to recommit ourselves to Jedi. Erica mentioned, like, that has been an ongoing conversation of our board. And I wanted to be able to have a recommitment to what Jedi was going to look like if it was going to operate under a new organizational name, rebranding, and purpose. And so my goal in that year was to really do less better. We pulled back on a lot of the work that we were doing so we could truly focus on pivoting. And I think that's really challenging when you are a chair and when you are a leader, because you want to continue the amazing work of the people before you, and you also have limited amount of time, resources, and energy. The board is a completely volunteer role, so everyone has families, full-time jobs, other things that they're doing outside of this work, and so it was my goal that we had the time and space to be able to really do this well. So that meant doing fewer events, fewer programming, really focusing on our two major goals, which was to promote the conference and to make this pivot happen. So in my role as chair, it was really about like producing this outcome that I knew I wanted to happen by a certain endpoint. And in that, we had to centralize our processes and find opportunities to collaborate across the board, because we were still operating very virtually, and I wanted people to know each other, and I wanted people to understand each other's roles and be able to give feedback. And so we started using resources like Airtable, and we linked those resources to our Google Calendar. So we were all very aware of different tasks and deadlines that were coming up for our conference and for this pivot. And we also continue to look into how can we capitalize on the strengths of the board? Who has expertise in certain areas that other people don't? Where can we reach out to our community in Portland here and have conversations with other people who have gone through this process or who are experienced in this process? And then continue to refer to evidence-based practices, so we really can have a sense of defensibility and intentionality in our work when we were going to actually do the pivot. Next slide. So in the short term, the pivot goals were we really wanted to focus on being change makers in higher education, and that meant being, to Erica's point, much more active, much more intentional. And so we wanted to support the culture and the cultural shift that we needed to see to really feel like we were creating less harm and that we were supporting the communities that we knew could really benefit from the work that we were hoping to do moving forward. And in that, we really wanted to see that we were able to better retain our membership, and especially better retain our diverse and underrepresented membership. And we wanted to ensure that accessibility was at the forefront of everything we did. And we reached out to amazing people, Michelle Bromley, who I know is on this call today. We reached out to people who were already amazing members, who we could, ask important questions and ask the really challenging questions, because sometimes as an organization, it's really hard to admit that you've been failing your members. And so we were able to be much more vulnerable in understanding what we had been failing to do and how we could do better, and becoming more adaptable and creating an organization that was prepared to continuously adapt along the landscape of gender in higher education. Internally and externally, we really wanted to create a position that was going to hold this and continue to have these conversations. And diversity is not a column. There's operations, there's the chair, there's marketing, there's education. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion is a row. It goes across everything we do. And so we wanted somebody who was really going to hold that conceptually. And so we implemented that role in 2022. And that person is responsible for building and continuing to ally this organization with other affinity-based organizations in and across higher education, so we can continue to ensure that our board is educated and continuing to think about the landscape as it continues to develop in higher ed. Next slide.
Just a quick time flag too, while we're at this nice pause.
Okay, thank you. So one of the examples of the outputs of the work we did a membership re-engagement pilot. The goal of this was to engage our inactive members and use that data scraping as an opportunity to gather more insight as to why people are not engaged, why we've lost contact, and figure out how we can use that information and apply it to the pivot. So we were able to use our membership list in MailChimp, and our director of records and analytics went through and identified our least engaged members, and one by one reached out to them and surveyed as many as she could. To understand why people haven't been subscribing, why they haven't been attending our conferences, and really using that data to ensure that the next iteration of OE, which would be GAIN, could be something that is more proactive than reactive in ensuring that our members have space to engage with us. And if they don't, how can we create opportunities for their input? So I have a good data visual. Next slide. And so here you can see this is the outcome of that. About 22% of OE's members had been cleaned from MailChimp over the years. That's about 279 people. And from the survey, we were able to find that about 22% of them just had left higher ed, 22% of them have moved out of Oregon, and 27% of them still work in higher ed in Oregon. So we knew that there was room for us to still re-engage our members. Next slide. This is some data from our last in-person OE conference. You can see, and I'm going to go into more detail in the next slide, that our last in-person conference, which I think is the best traditional example of like what our conferences had looked like in terms of data in our audience pre-pandemic, was predominantly white, straight, cisgendered women. And so it's not shocking. Oregon is not a particularly diverse state in terms of race. And it's also not shocking because our organization, to Erica's point, the giant W, our organization and its branding at the time was attracting that community. And we wanted to really think about what was it going to look like when we changed, and knowing the data, knowing what we know, was our current membership going to need some education to prepare for the pivot and what it's going to mean for what their role is going to be under this new organization, knowing that it is predominantly white, straight, cisgendered women. Next slide. And so we worked really closely with our Inclusion Advisory Committee and really had to take a look at like what were the values that were being promoted out into the organization, and what was going to need to change, and asking ourselves a series of questions. Many of these are very rhetorical and don't have straightforward answers, but really challenging ourselves. And here's what we know about the organization. Here's what we know about what is being said on our website and in our communications about what we do. And what is the need? What is the problem and why? How are we exclusive? How are our systems and outputs exclusive? Who do we want to serve better? And who are we actually serving? And who do we say we serve? Were huge gaps. And who's going to hold this responsibility? What are comparators? What are our demographics? Why, is it still Oregon? Is it still for Oregon? Is it still for Oregon women? Is it still higher education? You'll notice that GAIN, the little logo in the bottom right-hand corner, we removed Oregon from the organization as well. We realized that while we wanted to be more gender inclusive, we also recognize that we're losing members because they're just physically leaving the state of Oregon. And as a nonprofit, we really wanted the opportunity to welcome members from, the Pacific Northwest, really anybody who was really active and engaged in this work, because we realized that being able to expand the physical geographic boundaries of this organization would allow us to have more informed people joining us and contributing to these conversations. Okay, let's see here. The last slide. Perfect. We facilitated a town hall, and this was really to circle back to ensuring that we were giving our members the opportunity to contribute to this conversation, have really difficult conversations, and navigate what their role was going to be in the next iteration of the board. And we used and paid a professionally trained facilitator, Erica Bestpitch, who was at Portland State's Women's Resource Center, to facilitate this conversation. And it really gave us the opportunity to gauge what level of training and education our members would need moving forward. And I'll go ahead and move to the next page or the next slide. And finally, as a chair, these are some things that I wish I could tell my, prior self. You're gonna make mistakes. You're gonna make so many mistakes. And so constant learning and relearning, training, and building that education into the expectation of the board and yourself is going to be important. Being both vulnerable and defensible, you should make every decision with feedback, advice, and intentionality, and ask the really tough questions. And create accountability measures for yourself, whether that's through systems such as Airtable, where you can create very time-bound accountability measures, but also creating accountability for your vendors. So if you are doing a conference, making sure your vendors, that includes the hotel, food, AV, everyone is on board and understands the intention of the work you're doing, and they are also held to the same expectations. And pay people for their expertise. If you want quality work and you want intentionally Jedi-based work, those people are not only taking a lot of time to be informed and relevant in the work that they're doing within the scope of Jedi, but that's a lot of emotional labor that they're putting into the work. So if you're going to ask people to do trainings and be participatory, you should pay them for their time.
Thank you so much, Shania. Should have done that before I unmuted. So we're almost at time. I do wonder if we could, I had one quick question. If there's time for maybe one person from each organization to answer, which is like, how do you respond to people or prepare to respond to people who are leaving your organization because they're not on board with inclusion? Maybe they're not on board with this explicit inclusion of trans people, for example. So how do you have those conversations with them, if at all? Yeah, Eric, I just saw your hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying bye.
Oh. Does anyone want to answer that? Yeah, and for those who have hard stops, totally understand. We are at time here in 2 minutes. So we'll see if we can get any thoughts out about that. Everyone has hard stops.
I think I would just put it out there that if anyone has remaining questions, or this is really a conversation. So if anyone has questions about SGP, actually you could talk to a number of people on this. But please feel free to reach out. You know, we'll have coffee, we'll have a virtual coffee, because I think, yeah, these are conversations that we need to have. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. That was a great close. I'm adding the websites here. Yeah, add us on LinkedIn, reach out if you have questions about any of this specifically. I know we didn't have time to get into questions, but hopefully what we have been able to learn can, can be helpful for others as well. So thanks to everyone for joining us. I learned a ton. So thank you to our panelists for all of your work on this and educating us. And yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us today. It was really great to have this session with everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.